And we're back discussing John Durham Peters' Marvelous Clouds, Chapter 7, God and Google. Joined again by my good old buddy here, Big Friend. Um, Before I get into the chapter, I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about God and Google, or that idea. So I had just went to upload the first video to Vimeo because Professor Navarro outlined his preference for Vimeo over YouTube in the syllabus. When I went to do so, Vimeo was like, this video is too big. You got to pay us monthly if you want to upload this. So I obviously jumped over to YouTube, and it's still processing now, which is taking so long. But um, it just kind of reminded me of, this whole thought within this chapter about how on its face, Google is this free search engine, or you know it owns YouTube. So YouTube is this free like video sharing website and application. um, but really, like, what it is this sort of like omniscient data miner. And the whole thought that nothing, including information and knowledge, is ever free. So we'll get more into that a little later. But one of the first things that Durham Peters does in this chapter is he kind of ponders what the internet is. And he reflects on the fact that its vastness implies like a certain level of inattainability. And one of his meditations throughout this chapter is on Borges's Library of Babel, and just the ways in which knowledge, and especially like that amount of like overwhelming. I mean, that amount of knowledge can be overwhelming. He goes on to talk about the Rosh Hashanah greeting, may you be inscribed into the book of life, and this idea of the book holds the world. And paraphrasing Leroy Goran, he says that only in an oral culture is the total stock of knowledge in alignment with what a moral knower can retain. Um, and then goes on to explain how more digital data is generated every year than all the writing ever done in history. And I think that the numbers he gives is like, if you take all the books that are in existence, it adds up to about like 50 petabytes, but Google processes 20 petabytes of data a year. So we're talking about unquantifiably larger amounts of data. And he discusses the fact that um, John Milton was rumored to have like read all the books available to him, in his day, which even at that time would have been probably an unachievable task. But to think about consuming like every single piece of literature now is just like beyond the realm of fathomability. He also talks about how the printing press refueled the complaint that there is just simply too much to know. And, that's kind of just in line with this whole like bit of thinking. And something really interesting that he said too in this chapter is that books you have read share this deep ontological similarity with the books that you haven't, and it's that both can be profoundly fuzzy. So, like, even as far as the books that we do read, the amount that we retain is not nearly as much, or to the level that one would hope it would be. And that's definitely something that I could relate to. I think about all the books that I've read and loved and have really hit home for me. And if you think about like the minute details within them, they become extremely fuzzy. Like if you've ever reread a book, you've definitely experienced that, you know, um, like becoming reacquainted with it. Like you'll read something, oh wow, I remember that. These like bits of deja vu. But if you were to sit and try to like recall them to your memory, you wouldn't be able to. He talks about how the Google search engine is a convenient target to see how the arts of memory are altered by digital infrastructures. And that's something that I thought about, like a lot throughout the rest of this chapter. Um, and it's just so true. I remember being an undergrad originally, and this is before the advent of smartphones, so it's not like you could just pull out your phone and fact check right on the spot. But there was this kid in my freshman hall who just he was like a pathological liar, and he would just make things up. So I remember we would all like run back to our rooms and fact check him real quick on Google. And it made me think about the ways in which, like, 30, 40, 50 years ago, you just had to know it, and like if you didn't know it, you would have had to take what he said, I guess, with a grain of salt, and go to a library, or if you had an encyclopedia collection at home, and try to like fact check him that way. And just the ways in which these points of convenience can also, become kind of like crutches, ways in which you rely more on the apparatus than your own cognitive functions. Also, this whole line of thinking, reminded me of Plato and Derrida, and the idea of oral versus written word. And it's just like funny how we've been having this same conversation for millennia, right? Like, the advent of writing at the time was like, oh no, that removes you. It like removes you another step away from like the creative divinity. Like, um, every time you add a layer of technology to the creative process, you're actually stepping further away from your link to the divine. Um, okay. Something that he pointed out that I thought was really interesting was that knowledge is not the gathering, but the throwing away of information. And I definitely agree with that sentiment. Kind of like before we were talking about with like the minute details of the books that we've read. Um, it's probably like an evolutionary, like explained evolutionarily, evolution. It's probably explained like on the level of evolution that we only retain the information that we need to know. So our brains are constantly purging these other things that are irrelevant to what like is actually needed information. Another thing that he talked about, which really struck me, was he says long vanished books, newspapers, film clips, videos, magazines, songs, and photos are reappearing in mushrooming digital compilations. The same is true of dead people who keep popping up on social media as if back from the dead. And I mean, like, I definitely agree with that entirely. And I see the ways in which this happens, like on my own social media platforms. Like, I follow Freddie Mercury and Bob Marley, for instance. And I would imagine that those are like run by their estates because they're verified. um, they're verified personas. But like the thought that Freddie Mercury is making a Facebook post is kind of ridiculous, right? I also thought about how Bill Cosby had bought all of the rights to the Little Rascals episodes, and basically locked them away because he claimed that they were racist. I'm not going to get into whether or not I agree or disagree with that, but I'm thinking about the ways in which if you were to try to do that today, it would be probably impossible. Like, there's just digital versions of everything. Like, you know, there's just this constant obsession with digitizing old media. And I think like another way that we can frame this whole social media as bringing people back from the dead is to think about like the Epstein didn't kill himself memes, like the ways in which the internet will kind of not let you forget about certain things, which is probably beneficial. Uh, Another thing that he talks about is the universe as a library, and again, he brings up Jorge Luis Borges, um, and he says that he's the man who conceived that the universe is a library, and he understood better than anyone the fragility of memory, the strange ontology of the book, and the theology of monstrous catalogs. And he really goes on to flesh out this idea of the strange ontology of books, and he reflects on the being of books. um, he has this whole long list of like everything that the book is a body, the book is a ghost, the book is like divorce papers. It's all of these written records that are left behind, but like kind of consumed by the ether of being. Uh, he says that since our time is limited, each book is both a blessing and a burden. And he discusses the ways in which books and knowledge can overwhelm us again. As previously discussed, um, when you look at the sheer volume of knowledge and information out there, uh, it can easily overwhelm you, kind of in ways that nature is even incapable of doing so. And he talks about like, well, why is it that we can walk into a library, like a big library, and we're just surrounded by thousands and thousands of books, we can feel more overwhelmed than when we walk into something like, a forest, which is probably equally, in its. Hello?